Committee will come to order. I'd like to begin this hearing by stating the Oversight Committee mission statement. We exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have the right to know the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. We will work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is the mission of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Today we are here to discuss the role of liquefied natural gas, the exports, and how we are handling that in national security policy and foreign policy. This hearing builds on another hearing held by this subcommittee last year that focused on the Department of Energy's strategy and process in reviewing applications to support LNG, specifically to non-free trade agreement countries. At that hearing, we were joined by Mr. Christopher Smith of DOE, who is here again with us today. Thank you. I would also like to welcome Deputy Assistant Secretary Hochstein. Is it correct, Hochstein? From the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources. Thank you both for coming. By now, it's obvious the United States is in the middle of an energy production revolution. This is due almost entirely to advanced drilling techniques such as hydraulic fracturing, horizontal well drilling. That gives us access to resources that were not previously recoverable. Prior to 2005, it was estimated that there was less than 200 trillion cubic feet of dry natural gas proved reserves in the United States. As of 2010, that number had risen to over 300 trillion cubic feet, an increase of over 50% in just 5 years. Economic studies such as the NERA study commissioned by the DOE to inform its decision-making on LNG exports indicate the United States will see a net economic benefit from LNG exports. Energy exports could also be a powerful and much-needed foreign policy tool should we choose to wield it. Many of our friends and allies are forced to buy their oil and gas from the resource autocracy of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. In order to meet its domestic power needs, Ukraine imports over 60% of its natural gas. All these imports are from Russia. This gives Russia an immense amount of power over Ukraine. This is also the case for several other Eastern European countries, such as Hungary and Lithuania. Russia has a habit of squeezing its neighbors' energy supplies when it wants to influence their actions. The United States has the resources to counter this and to come to the aid of our Eastern European allies. What it needs is the political will. As mentioned in our previous hearing, the subcommittee is familiar with the DOE process for approving LNG export licenses. For countries with which we have a free trade agreement covering natural gas, the Natural Gas Act of 1938 requires DOE to grant applications to export LNG. Such export is deemed to be consistent with the public interest, and the authorization must be granted without modification or delay. For countries with which we do not have a free trade agreement covering natural gas, the Natural Gas Act still presumes that DOE will grant the application to export LNG unless the Department finds the proposed exportation will not be consistent with the public interest. The United States has exported natural gas via pipeline to Canada and Mexico since the 1930s. Furthermore, the U.S. has exported LNG from the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska since 1969. For the lower 48 states, in May of 2011, the Department of Energy granted the first permit to export LNG to non-FTA countries. That facility is currently under construction in southwest Louisiana and will begin exporting LNG very soon. When we had our last hearing on this topic, this was the only facility approved for non-FTA export. I am pleased to see that number is now 7. However, there are still 24 applicants waiting for DOE approval. I encourage DOE to process these applications expeditiously. The process to determine that exporting excess American product is in our national interest has stretched on for months. In December of 2012, President Obama said to Time magazine, "The United States is going to be a net exporter of energy because of new technologies and what we are doing with natural gas and oil." The President also recognized that these energy developments could have a huge geopolitical consequence. It would seem that the President's remarks are embodied in the State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources. This Bureau, set up only a few years ago, states as one of its goals to manage the geopolitics of today's energy economy through a reinvigorated energy diplomacy with major producers and consumers. One objective that I hope to accomplish with this hearing is to get a sense of how the Administration is taking advantage of this national security and diplomatic opportunity afforded by the export of LNG. It seems clear to me this Administration has identified LNG exports as a valuable, if not crucial, part of U.S. diplomacy and strategic relations. I would like to make sure that the different parts of our government are communicating effectively and efficiently. Is DOE aware of the foreign policy objectives pushed by the State Department? Are these agencies working harmoniously to advance the Administration's goals? Are there any intragovernmental barriers that we can help fix to move this along? Allowing more exports of this domestic commodity will have a clear effect on the fulfillment of our foreign policy agenda. We need to ensure that we have a strategy in place that safeguards our allies from political volatility outside their borders, and we must have the cross-agency coordination to carry it out. I thank the witnesses for appearing, and I look forward to your testimony. With that, I recognize the distinguished ranking member, the gentlelady from California, Mrs. Speer, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Lankford, for holding today's hearing. I look forward to what I hope will be an informative discussion. First, I certainly agree that Russian control of the natural gas supplies into and through Ukraine is a critical issue. The European Union gets 24% of its gas from Russia, but some countries, such as Lithuania, Finland, and Latvia, are dependent on Russia for the entirety of their supply. Considering President Putin's obvious imperial ambitions, the United States must help our European allies lessen their dependence on Russian gas as much as possible. Unfortunately, at least in the short term, proposals to help Ukraine by fast-tracking approvals of new LNG export terminals will not meet the goal intended of quickly getting U.S. LNG to Europe and Ukraine in particular. Currently, the U.S. has only one LNG export terminal in Alaska, with another terminal in Louisiana scheduled to start operation in 2015. Building more terminals and finding the private investment to fund them will take several years. I am all in favor of giving the Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission the resources they need to speed the permitting process. FERC, in particular, has a complex and slow process which could benefit from additional resources. However, we shouldn't pretend that faster permitting alone is a panacea. In addition, the main barrier to the U.S. export to Europe is not the permitting process. It is the fact that U.S. gas shipped to Europe would be substantially more expensive than cheap Russian gas. Most experts agree that LNG exports from the U.S. would be far more likely to go to Asia, where prices are higher than in Europe. This is not to say that the U.S. should not aim to market gas to Europe, but taking note that conducting foreign policy via energy export is complex. So how can we help Ukraine given these practical constraints? A number of efforts are already underway. The U.S. is working with the EU and the International Monetary Fund on a number of efforts to move Europe towards a greater diversity of energy sources, such as reversing flows of natural gas from existing pipelines into Ukraine and further developing Ukraine's own natural gas resources. Encouraging energy efficiency rarely makes headlines, but in Ukraine it could be a game changer. Ukraine produces nearly as much gas as it uses, but Ukrainians are notoriously profligate energy users, thanks to government energy subsidies. By implementing the same efficiency measures that other European countries already use, Ukraine could be nearly self-sufficient. Mr. Chairman, I think these efforts to use America's resources to bolster our foreign policy are admirable and will become increasingly important over the next decade. However, we must not lose sight of the economic and environmental side effects of our current energy boom. A Brookings Energy Security Initiative study found that U.S. LNG exports would have a modest upward impact on domestic prices. Even this modest increase, estimated to be around $50 per family, would be damaging to low-income consumers, who must often choose between heating their homes and buying food. That means that an increase in LNG exports should go hand in hand with full funding of the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. We must also not forget the businesses and manufacturers that have built businesses plans around plentiful, low-priced natural gas. Creating jobs through LNG export could be offset by the loss of jobs elsewhere in the economy. Increasing LNG exports would also increase the environmental risks associated with drilling and gas liquefaction. A strong foreign policy cannot come at the cost of polluting Americans' drinking water with unknown chemicals from fracking fluid or drowning the coasts, including my district with uncontrolled sea level rise. U.S. LNG exports can provide substantial benefits, but we must be realistic about what is feasible and control for the costs. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and to our witnesses for being here today.
Members will have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record. We will now recognize our first and only panel. Mr. Christopher Smith is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy. Mr. Amos Hochstein is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy in the Bureau of Energy Resources of the U.S. Department of State. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses are sworn in before they testify. If you please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, I'd ask you to limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for oral discussion and questions after your testimony is finished. Obviously, your written statement will be made a part of the permanent record as well. Mr. Smith, you're recognized first.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Lankford and Ranking Member Speer and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Department of Energy's program regulating the export of natural gas, including liquefied natural gas. The incredible abundance we are experiencing in our domestic natural gas supply provides unprecedented opportunities for the United States. Over the last several years, domestic natural gas production has increased significantly, outpacing consumption growth, resulting in declining natural gas imports. Production growth is primarily due to the development of improved drilling technologies, including the ability to produce natural gas trapped in shale formations. Production from these sources made up less than 2% of the U.S. supplies in 2000 and rose to 40% of that total in 2012, a dramatic change. Historically, the Department of Energy has played an important role in development of technologies that have enabled the United States to expand development of these energy resources. Beginning in the late 1970s, research investments by the Department contributed to the development of hydraulic fracturing and extended horizontal lateral drilling technologies that were later refined and commercialized through private sector investments and continued industry innovation, unlocking billions of dollars in economic activity associated with shale gas production. Thanks to American ingenuity and know-how applied to our abundant domestic natural gas resources, the United States is now the world's #1 natural gas producer and is poised to become a net exporter of natural gas by 2018, according to the Energy Information Administration. Today, domestic natural gas prices are lower than international prices of delivered LNG to overseas markets. As in the United States, demand for natural gas is growing rapidly in foreign markets. Due primarily to these developments, the Department of Energy has received a growing number of applications to export domestically produced natural gas to overseas markets in the form of liquefied natural gas. The Department's authority to regulate the export of natural gas arises from the Natural Gas Act, which provides 2 statutory standards for processing applications to export LNG from the United States. By law, applications to export natural gas to nations with which the United States has a free trade agreement that provides for national treatment of trade in natural gas are deemed to be consistent with the public interest, and the Secretary of Energy must grant authorization without modification or delay. As of March 24th, the Department of Energy has approved 35 such applications. For applications to export natural gas to non-FTA nations, the Secretary must grant the authorization unless, after opportunity for hearing, the proposed export is found to not be consistent with the public interest. In executing that requirement, the Department of Energy has established a robust process to assess the public interest, a process that affords the opportunity for the public comment and transparency, and also allows a balance of the many aspects of public interest that are potentially affected by the export of natural gas. While Section 3A of the Natural Gas Act establishes a broad public interest standard and presumption favoring export authorizations, the statute neither defines public interest nor identifies criteria that must be considered. In prior decisions, however, the Department has identified a range of factors that it evaluates when reviewing an application for export authorization. These factors include economic impacts, international considerations, security of natural gas supply, environmental considerations, and others. To conduct its review, the Department looks to record evidence developed in the application proceeding. Applicants and interveners are free to raise new issues or concerns relevant to the public interest that may not have been addressed in prior cases. To date, the Department of Energy has granted 7 conditional authorizations for long-term applications to export domestically produced lower 48 LNG to non-FTA countries, equivalent to 9.3 billion standard cubic feet per day. As of today, 24 applications are pending to export LNG to non-free trade agreement countries. The Department will continue processing the pending non-FTA LNG export applications on a case-by-case basis, following the order of precedence previously established and set forth on the Department's website. During this time, the Department will continue to monitor any market developments and assess their impact and subsequent public interest determinations as further information becomes available. Given the topic of this hearing, I would also like to note that, as I mentioned earlier, the Department considers international factors as part of the public interest determination, among many other domestic factors. Of course, we are monitoring the situation in Europe very closely, and we certainly take energy security of our allies very seriously. We have taken recent global events into account in making decisions in recent applications. The United States' commitment to free trade is another factor in our reviews. An efficient, transparent international market for natural gas with diverse sources of supply provides both economic and strategic benefits to the United States and our allies. Indeed, increased production of domestic natural gas has already significantly reduced the need for the United States to import LNG. In global trade, LNG shipments that would have been destined for the United States markets have been redirected to Europe and Asia, improving energy security for many of our key trading partners. To the extent that the United States exports can diversify global LNG supplies and increase the volumes of LNG available globally, it will improve energy security for many U.S. allies and trading partners. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I would like to emphasize that the Department of Energy is committed to moving forward on LNG applications as expeditiously as possible. We understand the significance of this issue, as well as the importance of getting it right, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Mr. Hochstein.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me come appear before this committee, and Ranking Member Speer, thank you, and the members of the subcommittee. It's always good to be back here as someone who served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee staff. It's good to be able to be back in the House, so I appreciate the opportunity, especially in this critical topic. The hearing comes at a critical time. Today, the relationship between security and access to energy is drawn in sharp relief. With the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia and its role in the unrest in eastern Ukraine, we are witnessing the unacceptable and, frankly, shocking violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of one country by another. The Department of State is not the agency responsible for the process of approving natural gas export licenses, and my colleague Chris Smith from the Department of Energy has just addressed that issue. But the crisis led many to argue that accelerated approval of LNG exports is the magic bullet to provide energy security to our European allies and partners. While critically important, U.S. energy resources, including LNG exports, are just one tool among many that we can and are utilizing to address the energy security challenges in Europe and elsewhere. We have been working in many ways around the world to contribute to that energy security, and we will continue to do so in the weeks, months, and years to come. There are renewed fears that Russia will use energy as a political tool, as it did in January 2009, when Russia cut off gas supplies to Ukraine. All Russian gas flows through Ukraine were halted, cutting off supplies to southeastern Europe completely for 13 days. A shocked European Union began the process of moving toward diversifying its resources of energy and the routes by which the energy is delivered. The EU began to implement regulations and build infrastructure toward a common, integrated, and transparent energy market. The U.S. has been working closely with the EU to prevent a repeat of 2009 crisis. We established that year the U.S.-EU Energy Council, an annual meeting co-chaired by the Secretaries of State and Energy to address strategic energy issues and forms of collaboration. The first meeting was held that year in November of 2009. The fifth meeting was held just a few weeks ago. But we have to take into consideration as we look at these issues is the global context in which we are living and the supply-demand changes that have occurred around the world. First, the supply mechanism has changed from a small number of countries supplying the world to a much larger number of countries around the world supplying energy, both oil and gas. And in demand, while OECD countries were driving the demand until now, for the decades to come, that demand will be driven by non-OECD countries, principally China, India, and Asia. As we have worked with Ukraine and with Europe to address the energy security of Ukraine and of Europe as the downstream countries, we are looking, as the Ranking Member Speer said in her opening testimony, at not just the issue of LNG exports, but the issues that would require Europe to be able to address their own needs. And that means addressing the infrastructure shortages and shortfalls that Europe suffers from, with pipelines that go from Russia down south into Europe, to make sure that those are able to reverse flow so that they can supply Ukraine. The fact that Poland and Hungary have already been able to reverse their flows, and I'm pleased to announce that 2 days ago a major deal was reached between Slovakia and Ukraine to reverse the flow, These are steps that could not have happened had we not learned the lessons from 2009 and have spent the last 4 to 5 years working with our EU partners to make those changes available and capable. For example, the EU passed as a result of 2009, the third energy package, which changed the regulatory framework. Without that, today, the reverse flows into Ukraine would not have been possible. But it's not enough to look at this from a Russia to Ukraine and into Europe. We have to look at pipelines that go not just north-south, south to north, but east-west and west to east, so that gas can flow. We have to make sure that there's LNG receiving terminals so that there's capacity to receive the LNG, and that it is done in a way that is bankable and financeable. But as we look at this, this is not just about the United States and its exports that will come in the years to come. This is, as I talked about before, the supply chain. And I'm going to get to what Ranking Member Spear said in her opening testimony. We're looking at Australia coming online with enormous amounts of natural gas over the next several years. Mozambique and Tanzania have made impressive discoveries, and they too will come online in the coming decade. Offshore Israel is already delivering new gas to its domestic market and is poised to become an exporter in 2017 or 2018. Same for Cyprus, potentially Lebanon, Egypt, and the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean. North Africa, South America, and other areas are all looking to become new producers. So as we look at this, this is a global context that we have to understand how to address. And we are doing so today together with the Department of Energy, Department of State, and the rest of the administration to ensure that we can be there to allow and to make sure that not only Europe is supplied, but that energy is used as an energy resource for cooperation and not resource for conflict. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, LNG exports may become an important factor in assisting our allies and friends, but it is only that one factor, that one tool. And we have to work on all these other areas that I just mentioned in order to make sure that our commitment to energy security, as we did with the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline in the 1990s, and as we are doing now with the Southern Corridor from Azerbaijan and other projects, to make sure that that energy security is achieved. We are strongly committed to Europe's energy security, and we will continue our joint efforts with the EU to make that a reality. Thank you very much for allowing me to testify before you today.
Thank you. We'll begin with a 5 minutes of questioning. We'll go around the dais, and then we'll do a second round in just a moment. I'd like to first enter, without objection, Ambassador at Large for Energy Security, Dr. Anita Orban, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Hungary, a statement that she has written about this same hearing and some of the issues. Without objection, so ordered. She has a statement in this that I want to just be able to read to you quickly. She said she testified on the Hill March the 25th. She said, I used $400 as an example of how unrealistically high Russia may raise the price of 1,000 cubic meters of gas delivered to Ukraine if it chooses to use gas as an economic weapon. This was before they invaded Crimea. In fact, Moscow went above that number with a wild number and now quotes $485. Now, the current price is around $268, 4 times the amount that's the Henry Hub price. Given that Ukraine had difficulty setting its invoices even when the price was $268, the new price seems well beyond what Kiev will be able to cover. Ukraine may face a winter without gas supplies from the east and will have to either buy gas from the west or cave in politically. This is the reality that's on the ground. One other statement that she makes I think is pertinent. On April 11th, Russian President Vladimir Putin sent a letter to 18 European countries warning them about potential supply disruptions in the winter. This is hardball, and this is one of the situations that we have to be able to respond to and respond to with clarity in the process. I said one final statement. Let me read one final statement as well as she makes this. She said, U.S. LNG export liberalization is no panacea in the short term. The gas could not be delivered in large volumes to Ukraine immediately. It will not save Ukraine and possibly other parts of other parts of Central Eastern Europe from a very cold winter in 2014. Yet, it makes the medium-term solution very clear, and this prospect would have immediate impact on pricing and maybe even availability. Her request is interesting. Her request is, if we'll begin to act, it at least sets a marker out there that shows Russia that we're serious and they know that we're moving. 2 years ago, when we started the process of these conversations, I had 2 different individuals internationally that came to visit my office immediately, the Japanese and members of parliament from Ukraine, 2 years ago. And their question was the same. How quickly could we get American natural gas? Since that time period, multiple other countries have come to be able to visit with me with the same question. How quickly could we get American natural gas? This is one of those conversations that we need to be able to determine. I understand full well we have the first responsibility to take care of America and Americans. That is in our national interest. That is our first responsibility. But when there's economic benefit and there's also diplomatic strength that comes from the export of energy, this is one of those issues I continue to ask, why is it taking so long in the process? So I know that was a long statement for me to make as well. Mr. Smith, let me start this conversation. It's taken, depending on the different permit, sometimes it's taken 11 weeks, sometimes it's taken 8 weeks, sometimes it's taken, you know, the different times to be able to actually get a permit, one after another here. So the initial one, obviously the Sabine Pass approval, it took approximately 8 months after the application. But we've had some now that are 29, 27, 23 months after the application. Is this process getting faster? I know you're working through the process. Is it getting faster? Is the Department of Energy getting more efficient in the approval process?
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. First of all, as you note, we're working through the queue on a case-by-case basis. The first application we did obviously took some more time because we had to do, the full study to look at the cumulative impact. Since then, a lot of scrutiny has been made on the time between each applications. One might be 9 weeks, one might be 11 weeks, one might be 7 weeks. What I can say to that is that we've got a great team of people working to write these orders. Our focus is on making sure that we get the public interest appropriate and we get it right, and that we get an order that's going to withstand the scrutiny that it's sure to receive. So our task is to make sure that we keep moving forward as expeditiously as possible. There's not a timeline that we're on. There's not a clock that we follow. Essentially, the team looks at each issue. Each of the orders is different, so they're going to take different amounts of time because they're going to have require different analyses. But once each order is done, it's released by the team, and we move on to the next order. So that's the process that we've been on, and we're moving through the queue.
So let me interrupt real quick because I want to be able to transition on a lot of the folks speak. So at this point, you don't have a requirement on your team whether they take 2 years or 2 weeks to work through the next permit. It's just whenever they get done at whatever speed. The
requirement is to move forward as expeditiously and professionally as possible, but to make sure that they get the analysis right. So
but it may take 2 weeks or it may take 2 years.
It takes the time that it's required. Mr. Chairman. So it's not a time-bound requirement. It's a requirement bound on the necessity to make sure we make a good public interest determination.
Yeah, I'm very aware there's not a time bound on it, but the issue is the clock is ticking internationally.
All right.
I mean, that's part of the issue, is not only domestically but internationally. Let me move on. I want to be able to honor everyone's time today with that. Mr. Speer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's just address the likelihood that liquefied natural gas will go to Europe if it's manufactured here in the United States. Most of these are domestic companies with shareholders, correct? And do they not have a responsibility to acquire the highest price for their gas in order to maintain a profit that is appropriate? Let's ask Mr. Smith and Mr. Hochstein.
Thank you for the question. Certainly, I mean, I think you raised the point that once approved by the Department of Energy, the Department of Energy does not determine where the gas will go. It's going to be determined by the companies that receive the authorizations. And indeed, those companies will certainly move to send the gas to the place that has the best return for shareholders.
So what's the price differential between Europe and Asia?
Price of natural gas, as you state, is not like crude oil where there's more or less of a balanced price around the world. There's a difference. So while people talk about Henry Hub as the American price, Europe is at about, let's say, $4.60 or so traded these days, and Europe is anywhere between $10 and $13, and Asia is anywhere between $16 and $18, and then you have different regions within that probably are a little bit different. But I think it's important to note that you can't simply take one price in one area and make the transport of that equal. So if you take the price from the United States, LNG exports that are approved here, you would have to add the cost of the liquefaction, the transport, insurance, the regasification. The kind of increase in price that you would have to add on puts it right in the range of what prices are today in Europe. So it wouldn't be much above it, but it wouldn't be much below it either.
So the likelihood of it going to Europe is not nearly as great as it is to go to Asia in any case.
I think, as Mr. Smith said, we as a government don't tell our companies who to sell it to.
Exactly.
But I think you're right that the companies are going to make a decision where to sell it to. But if I may, I think the issue here is not where we send our gas. I think this is about a global market. And wherever our gas will go, and it's likely to go to wherever the traders feel that they need to put this gas based on a variety of factors, including price, it will make a difference in all other regions. So it will make a difference. As I think Mr. Smith said in his opening testimony, we've already made an enormous impact on the market by removing, if you look at the expectations of what we would be importing in 2014, just a few years ago, that delta is enormous.
Okay, Mr. Hochstein, I want to try to get a couple more questions in. One of the points that I think hasn't been made well enough yet is that the infrastructure in Europe to receive the LNG is not yet robust, and that these import terminals need to be built. Do we know how many need to be built? Do we know how much they would cost? Is that something that the United States would be or could invest in?
We are working with the EU on that issue for the last several years. There is quite a bit of capability at the moment that is full. There is more that is being built. The EU has had some regulatory challenges in getting some of these through. There's one in Lithuania that is going to be built. There are some in Italy. But there's also been a sharp decrease in demand for LNG in Europe over the last couple of years, partly because price of coal has come down quite a bit in the United States and made coal cheaper in Europe, so there's been a transition from gas to coal. There's also been very warm winters for the last couple of years that have affected demand. So you're right. I don't know that we would be as investors, that is for the private sector to do, but we are working with the EU to figure out how to make these financeable and bankable so that they're more likely to be built.
All right. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, saving Ukraine from its gas-related diplomatic disadvantage with Russia is both a matter of money and political reform. They say, the only way to extract Ukraine from the immediate payment crisis is to provide money for Ukraine to pay down its debts. However, that does not address the fundamental problem that resulted in Ukraine's indebtedness in the first place: massive corruption, opaque markets, and poor pricings. Mr. Hochstein, do you agree with that view, and what do you think we should be doing about that?
I do largely agree with that view. We have to look at this in a number of ways. The IMF package is hopefully going to be approved fairly soon. That will, with it, release American money that Congress has authorized, as well as European EU money. The need to pay down the arrears immediately is urgent, so that additional supplies can come and we don't have a cutoff. But we have to address the reform of the industry. This is an opportunity. This crisis is an opportunity for Ukraine to open a new page and to address the reform that the sector desperately needs, so that we don't end up in the same place that we are today a few years down the road after paying the debt.
Mr. Walberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, as I understand it, companies that are seeking to export LNG today are required to go to the Department of Energy seeking a determination on public interest. Could you tell us the criteria that the Department of Energy uses to determine that term, public interest?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for that question. So the Natural Gas Act essentially creates a rebuttable presumption that exports in the public interest, unless the Department determines that approving such application would be deleterious to the overall public interest. The law, however, does not give a specific definition of the public interest. That's been left to the Department to interpret. So we have a wide range of criteria that we use when we're looking at public interest. We look at impact on the economy, we look at job creation, we look at energy security, we look at prices, impacts on consumers, foreign issues, issues of international affairs. So there's a very broad range of factors that we use.
Are any of the factors weighed differently?
Well, one thing that we don't have is a formula or a matrix that we plug numbers into and get an answer out. Essentially, what we allow for is a period of public comment in which the public can opine on these, and we think that's a very important part of the process. We then have to make a qualitative decision on all the arguments that are made for and against LNG exports. And in fact, when you see one of the orders that we've written, they're extensive documents. We're required to make very clear and transparent the reasoning that we make for each one of these applications. So we have to talk about the arguments that are made and either accept or rebut each of those individual arguments.
Are international considerations weighed in any different way? Are they more significant, less significant? Do you work with the Department of Energy on making international determinations?
With the Department of State, certainly. So we work very closely.
Department of State.
Yeah, yes, Congressman. We work very closely with the Department of State on all issues. But in terms of international considerations, you'll see in the most recent order that we put out, there is a very specific reference to the importance of energy security for the United States allies and trading partners, and that is something that we do take into consideration. It's something that's very important to us.
But not heavier than any other factors?
Well, Congressman, I think that all these factors are important. I mean, we care about impacts on American consumers, we care about prices, we care about international impacts. So, I mean, all these are important.
Is the process working as well as you would like it to, in your determination?
I think that the team is doing an excellent job of making very important long-term, decadal energy decisions in terms of looking at public interest. So I think the team is doing a good job.
How many are awaiting approval right now, the projects?
Thus far, we've approved 7 projects. I think we've got more than 20 that are waiting in the queue. So to date, we've approved 9.27 billion cubic feet per day of exports, and we're working through that queue on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Mr. Hochstein, if you could tell us about the Unconventional Gas Technical Engagement Program and the Energy Governance and Capacity Initiative. Give us a little background on that.
For the last several years, the Department of State and our offices have worked together with the Department of Energy and other agencies with friends and allies around the world who have sought to look into the possibility of addressing their unconventional and shale resources. What we have done is we don't encourage any country to do or not to pursue unconventional, but if they are going to do so, to offer them the support of understanding the regulatory mechanisms to make sure it's done in a safe and environmentally sustainable way. And for that, we have a program that supports a number of countries. We've worked very closely with Poland. We actually started working with Ukraine before the crisis about a year ago, and we are looking at expanding that program now to be able to bring about more resources there. The EGCI program that you mentioned, Congressman, looks at the governance of oil and gas sector overall to make sure, again, that as we see new countries coming online as new producers, that they are not suffering from the same trap that some others have done before them, and to make sure that those resources are made available to all the people of that region and that country, and that it's done with a governance structure.
Are you achieving that goal in your estimation right now with the like Ukraine in the situation?
Yes, I think on the unconventional, yes, I do. It's a very difficult task, but I think that it's important that countries make the decision on unconventional based on science and not on emotions. And if they're going to do so, that we support them in being able to develop and increase their production from conventional and unconventional resources.
Thank you.
Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In order to expedite LNG exports, environmental concerns and what's in the public interest, it's my understanding, are involved in the process. Section 3 of the Natural Gas Act requires companies seeking to export natural gas to obtain approvals from the Department of Energy, Office of Fossil Energy, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Under this section, no export of natural gas will be permitted unless it is consistent with the public interest. So, Mr. Smith, can you describe the various approvals that are required and what the roles of each agency are?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Congressman. There's two primary agencies that are involved in this process. There's the Department of Energy, which essentially grants the authorization to export the molecule, and then there's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that grants permission to actually build the plant. So those are two different processes. They're separate, but they're both critical and important to get a project up and running and exporting natural gas.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Smith, what are the specific criteria for making the public interest determinations?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. There's a wide range of criteria that we use when we're looking at each one of these applications on a case-by-case basis. We have to look at a wide range of factors that are important for American consumers and American industry and our national security. So we look at energy security, we look at supply availability, we look at environmental impacts, we look at international effects, we look at prices, impacts on consumers, on industrial customers. So those are all things that we have to consider for each and every one of these applications.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hochstein, I don't know if I'm saying your name properly. Okay. People call me Cardenas, but I just want to make sure that I respect how your name is pronounced. Okay, Mr. Hochstein, are you aware of any provision and under the public interest determination for benefiting U.S. foreign policy?
We, as the State Department, are not involved directly in the approval process, but as Mr. Smith said, the Department of Energy and the Department of State work very closely together, and I think we share information, and that when they make their determination, they have our views in mind.
Okay. Mr. Smith, what, if any, environmental determinations does the Office of Fossil Energy make in determining the public interest?
So that's going to be on a case-by-case basis, depending on the application that we're looking at. But we're compelled to look at a wide range of issues, where the gas is coming from, how it might impact local communities. So those are things that are considered.
And what about other agencies?
Well, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the FERC, also has to do an environmental analysis. And in fact, we are a core operating agency in their environmental process that looks at the impact of the terminal itself, the footprint of the terminal, and the impact of actually constructing the facility itself. So we're a coordinating agency with FERC in that process, so we work together in that way.
Okay. Mr. Smith, would you describe the involvement of these processes as very simplistic or complicated?
I'd certainly say it's an important and complicated decision, and we've got processes that match the gravity of the decision we have to make.
For example, if somebody were to put in an application in January of 2010, and then all of a sudden somebody puts in what looks to be on the face of it a similar application in January of 2014, would you say that there are some variables that may have changed between those two?
There certainly would be variables that would change. Just temporally, and factors change, and each of the individual applications will have factors that might be different. So we have to consider the comments that are made by the public in this publicly transparent process, and we have to consider each of those on a case-by-case basis.
For example, in a hearing like this, do you imagine that in 2010 somebody would have mentioned Ukraine, 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 whereas now they may be mentioning it quite often? Is that a variable that perhaps complicates it a little bit more?
That certainly is something that's changed dramatically over the course of the past few months.
Yeah. One of the things that I find fascinating is that a lot of times when we have public hearings like this, people like to try to force the issue to be simplified more than it possibly can be. I mean, I got my degree in engineering, and the one class that I remember the most and that apply in almost everything that I've done since I've left college is something called feedback systems. And that's simply put, it's a class that every engineer of every kind takes as a freshman, and it basically explains that what goes in and what comes out is very different based on what happens in between. And no feedback system is identical to another, and it seems like that's the kind of thing that departments have to deal with on a daily basis. And I want to thank you very much for doing a very good job of simplifying it as much as possible so that we and the public can understand how complicated it is and how important it is. Thank you so much. I yield back my time.
Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hochstein, when can we expect a decision on the Keystone pipeline?
So unfortunately, I can't answer that question completely. We are
Do you know when the Keystone the application for the Keystone pipeline was filed?
I don't have the date in front of me, sir.
6 years ago, September 2008. When do you think we can expect a decision?
The process in the Department of State is, as you know, is ongoing, and as we
Are you involved in that decision?
I am personally not involved in the process. My office is.
You're the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy, big title, diplomacy in the title, and you're not directly involved?
I think that we have different people working on a variety of different issues. Obviously, I'm part of the leadership of the Bureau, so involved in that sense.
Mr. Hochstein, are you aware that the EPA's final report was released clear back in 2011, 3 years ago, stated there are no significant impacts on the environmental side? You aware of that?
Yes, I am, sir.
And folks who are going to make the decision, are they aware of that, the State Department?
I believe they are, sir.
Are they aware that 2.5 years ago, Congress sent the President a bill saying, hey, make a decision? The President delayed that and said, well, we want to wait for the Sandhill issue to be resolved. And you're aware that that's been resolved, Mr. Hochstein?
I am, sir.
And the people who are making that decision are aware that it's been resolved?
I believe people are aware of
They're aware that the governor of the state was initially against it. Now he's for it.
If I may, Congressman, I think that as the process continues and we look at a variety of the different issues that are affecting this
Do you
decision,
think we can get a decision before this year is over?
I can't answer that directly.
Then you would meet the 6-year time frame. If you get it done before September, you've done it in 6 years.
Congressman, if I may, one sentence, I think I can give you what I think is happening at the moment, and that is that as we have new data coming in, such as the decision of the court in Nebraska, we are not stopping the process. We're not suspending the process. The process is ongoing.
You know, the Washington Post said that waiting any longer, and this is not Jim Jordan, this is not the Washington Times, this is the Washington Post, said to not make a decision is absurd and laughable. Again, not Chairman Lankford, not members on the Republican side, the Washington Post. And it kind of is 6 years. And you're telling me you don't know if you can get it done before September of this year and meet the 6-year time frame.
What I'm saying, Congressman, is as we are trying to make the process move as expeditiously as possible.
Now that cannot be true. That cannot be true, Mr. You're trying to make it move as expeditious as possible. The Washington Post says it's absurd not to make a decision now. It's been almost 6 years. There's no way you can use any other adjective you want to use, but expeditious is probably the wrong one to use.
We have a significant and overwhelming volume of public comments that we are going through. We have a court decision in Nebraska that just was announced just a few weeks ago.
But that
has to be addressed.
So my point is when?
On the route.
My point is when? Or maybe a better question is, will you ever make a decision?
Yes, we will make.
You will make a decision at some point. Okay. Well, that's a step in the right direction, because there are some people who are starting to think there's never going to be a decision. Now, do you think it will happen? Let's take this date. Do you think it will happen before the November elections this fall?
Sir, I can't speak.
Is it likely to happen before the November elections this fall?
As I was trying to say, sir, I can't.
Do you want it to happen before the November elections this fall?
Did you want me to answer, sir?
I want to change that last one first, if you could.
Okay.
Do you want it to happen before the November elections?
I would like to be able to go through the process in the way that we are required to do, addressing all the issues that have come before us, including the recent data. Had you asked me this question a few weeks ago before the court decision in Nebraska, that we would have been in a different situation. I think what we're trying to do is
the Washington Post used the terms absurd and laughable, knowing about the court issue, Mr. Hochstein. You're aware of that, correct?
I'm aware of what the Washington Post said. I don't speak. They don't speak for me, and I don't always agree with.
Let me just ask you this: will there be a decision before the November elections of this year?
As I said, Congressman, I can't stick to what a specific timeline of when this decision.
Okay, yes or no? Do you, as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy, want there to be a decision before the November elections this fall?
I would like to be in the position where we've done all the work that we're required to do to be at a position in the timeline that we can do. If that is before the election, then I hope that that is done. But what I cannot say is whether or not we're going to be able to make that timeline. We are trying. We have a lot of people working on this. There are a number of factors that we are looking at, including the enormous volume.
We want you to try harder. It's been 6 years. We want you to try harder. Frankly, we want a decision yesterday, but we know that's not going to happen. So at a minimum, it makes sense the American people could know about this before an important midterm election. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
it is becoming increasingly apparent that to stop any permit, you just flood the office with public statements and everything stops. At some point, leaders have to make decisions. With that, I recognize Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's return back to the topic of today's hearing, which is liquefied natural gas. The crisis in the Ukraine is yet another reminder of how energy independence and our national security interests are closely tied. Countries like Russia have shown, obviously, that they're more than willing to use energy as a weapon. Natural gas exports have the potential to not only provide significant economic benefits to our country's national security interests, but can also advance our national security interests and increase energy security. While this discussion of the international picture of energy security is important, I want to focus a little bit on the domestic side and what these effects can be for our domestic consumers of LNG. Mr. Smith, studies that the DOE has commissioned have found that the export of natural gas will have a net benefit on our economy, and that there is significant potential here for bringing more wealth to our country and creating more American jobs, something I think we all agree with. The Gas Technology Institute, a not-for-profit research lab that I'm proud to have in my district, has been at the forefront of developing technologies that make natural gas development safer, more efficient, more environmentally sustainable, and in turn have really helped to make the natural gas success story one of our wins in our domestic industry. Mr. Smith, do you see that efforts and capital investments in exporting more natural gas will also help to develop greater use of natural gas domestically? For example, the use of LNG as transportation fuel, or to meet its domestic demand for its use to generate electricity?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Congresswoman. First of all, the Department of Energy has a long relationship with the Gas Technology Institute, and that relationship has actually been very instrumental in developing many of the technologies that have led to this increase in our domestic production of natural gas. In terms of I guess the interaction between LNG exports and domestic use, if the United States does move forward to export additional quantities, if these terminals are built by the private sector, it's essentially going to put greater demand on our domestic supply here domestically, and that's going to have impacts on a variety of things, and that's what we look at in our public interest determination. In terms of exporting LNG, increasing the use of liquefied natural gas for transportation, I don't see a strong correlation between those two issues. I mean, I think they're driven by different factors. But indeed, we are seeing a greater use of natural gas in the transportation sector, particularly in fleet vehicles. We're seeing that being picked up right now, and we think that's important. It creates greater options for American consumers and American businesses. It helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so we see that as being very positive.
You know, I also represent, Mr. Smith, a lot of small manufacturers. I have the largest concentration of tool and die manufacturers in the nation is in my district, for example. And many of the folks I've talked to in domestic manufacturing have expressed real concerns that increased exports will lead to price increases at home and in turn harm our businesses and consumers. What effect does DOE expect natural gas exports to have on the domestic manufacturing sector's consumption and the prices that we must pay domestically for natural gas?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Congresswoman. We're certainly concerned about consumers in Poland and the Ukraine, but we're also very concerned about consumers in Illinois and Ohio and Oklahoma. So we have to take both into consideration, which is why these public interest determinations are indeed complicated. The Department of Energy has commissioned a number of studies that have looked at price impacts, significantly the nearest study that was done before the Sabine Pass export. And so it showed in most cases, a modest impact on industry. It showed a modest impact on consumers, but one that we do have to take into consideration and balance against the benefits of LNG exports, the balance of trade, job creation in producing states, greater production, other things. So it's a balancing act that we have to show. But we certainly are interested and concerned about potential impacts on consumers and, importantly, on those businesses that use natural gas to create jobs. So that's a very important factor in our considerations.
Thank you. I have real concerns that our foreign manufacturing competitors don't take advantage of our cheap natural gas prices at the expense of our domestic manufacturers. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the hearing. I would like to focus a little bit more on the domestic side of that for a moment. I represent the State of Georgia, Mr. Smith, where I'm told, depending on the day of the week, Southern Company, our utility down there, is either the #1, #2, or #3 consumer of natural gas in the nation. And yet, Southern Company has come out in support of LNG exports as part of that national mix. But our pipes are full in our part of the world. We can't get any more gas in our infrastructure. I look at the map on the EIA website of where the natural gas is coming from, and I'm thinking, man, how in the world are they getting that stuff out of the Bakken? I listened to that conversation that Mr. Jordan and just had here, and I think, what's the impact that prices have on domestic manufacturers is going to be dramatically different if we have a infrastructure that can get every diesel gallon equivalent of natural gas out of the Bakken and down into the great state of Georgia than if we don't have that infrastructure in place. Talk to me about what kind of infrastructure needs to be created, which I suspect will be dominantly pipeline infrastructure, in order for the American consumer and our exporters to be able to maximize the use of our natural resources.
Well, thank you, Congressman, for that question, and a lot of really big issues there. First of all, I'll mention that the Department of Energy has a very important collaboration with Southern Company. One of the most important demonstrations of carbon capture and sequestration is being done in Kemper County in collaboration with Southern. So that's been a really important initiative that has potential to benefit both the company here and internationally. In terms of the infrastructure question, I mean, that's actually a really big topic. When we look at the growth of shale gas and the success that we've had here in the United States versus the challenges that you have in Europe, the challenges that you have in China, one of the big factors that was in our favor here in the United States was the fact that there was already a very robust infrastructure in place, such that as fields were drilled, you had a way to get that gas to market. And that indeed is built and expanded by the private sector as new gas is developed. There's the potential for infrastructure to lag the resource in areas in which you have very rapid growth, and we've seen a bit of that in North Dakota. We've seen a bit of that in South Texas. But overall, there's certainly a very direct profit motive to build these infrastructure facilities that are necessary to make sure that we get this energy to the consumers that are going to be using it, and we believe that's generally happening.
And do you believe that profit motive exists irrespective of the answer to the LNG exports question?
Certainly. I mean, I do not see LNG exports as being the single factor that determines whether or not private industry builds the infrastructure that we need to get gas to markets.
And so when I see natural gas being flared off around the country due to a lack of infrastructure, clearly either the motivation is not there today because of low gas prices, or the cooperation is not there today to go through the permitting process to get that infrastructure installed.
Well, that's actually a big question, Congressman. I mean, there's a challenge when you have lots of associated gas that's being produced along with oil in places where the oil is valuable and the gas is a byproduct of the oil production. And so if you're in a situation where the infrastructure would be expensive to build, sometimes it's difficult for companies to justify the expense of building that infrastructure when they have the option of flaring the gas instead of building infrastructure to take it to market. So there's a market inefficiency there somewhere, but certainly state regulators and industry are working together to try to make that work better.
But from a DOE perspective, DOE is just willing to let those market forces be at play. If those market forces require that we flare off our natural resources to no benefit of the consumer, fair enough. And if those market forces require that we need to build a pipeline to get those resources to consumers, then they'd be supportive of that as well.
Well, I wouldn't characterize that as a matter of willingness. I mean, the Department of Energy has a mission. So we're the technology organization. You know, I oversee the National Energy Technology Laboratory that does much of the R&D, both intramurally and with with industry and academia that leads to solutions for environmental sustainability and safety. I think we're working together with State regulators in some cases, but there's a question of oversight over some of these questions, and a lot of them are complex and involve multiple market actors in the private sector.
Now, speaking on behalf of the State that gave America the President, who created the Department of Energy, we support your mission of creating a safe and sustainable structure here in the country that hopefully will not only lead to the manufacturers that Ms. Duckworth talked about, but really change our balance of trade with the world. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for holding the hearing. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're holding this hearing at an interesting time when there's a lot of talk internationally about natural gas and perhaps new opportunities, new marketing opportunities here where we see very low prices, even given the technology and environmental challenges. So my question is really for Mr. Hochstein. And Mr. Hochstein, I promise to give you time to answer my questions. You hear much of it off the top of the heads of people talk about our natural gas supplies being of aid to Europe and even Ukraine during the crisis that Ukraine is now experiencing. According to the figures I have, Europe gets a quarter of its gas from Russia, and half of that, and that was really news to me, half of that passes through Ukraine. We remember that in 2009, early in 2009, the pipelines were shut down through Ukraine. What was the reason for that again, please?
There was a price dispute between Ukraine had not paid its debts, and the Russians shut down the gas supply to Ukraine first and then to the rest of southeastern Europe through Ukraine a few days later.
So that didn't have much of an effect on Europe at that time because of the short duration?
It had actually a tremendous effect in both 13 days of no gas in the dead of winter. And Europe uses gas primarily for heating, so the timing was not accidental.
What did it do, increase the price?
What it did,
I mean, was there real scarcity going to Europe?
It lasted 20 days in total, 13 days for most of Europe. And as a result, what it really did was drove home the realization of the vulnerability that Europe has in its reliance on Russian gas and its need for diversification. Because it only lasted 13, the pain was short-lived.
Well, does that mean that Europe is less dependent on Russia today? Did it diversify?
Europe did a number of things, and we worked very closely with Europe for the last 5 years to do that. They are less reliant today on Russia, while still are extremely reliant, and they will be for a long time to come. But because they passed the third energy package, which required that the destination clauses be gone, it meant that when Russia exports gas into the EU, the first country of transit, let's say Germany or Ukraine or other EU countries, could not say, they couldn't dictate, you may not pass this on without my permission to another country. So what it allowed it to do is the minute the gas comes into the EU, it is now EU gas and can be transferred further. So as we talked before about reversing the flows from Poland, from Hungary, from Slovakia into Ukraine, that would not have been possible in 2009 because of the regulatory structure that was in place. So by working with Europe to get the regulatory structure there, making some investments, getting them to make investments in infrastructure, they are less reliant today. But as Russia will continue to be a supplier into Europe, there is more we can do together to make sure that that reliance is diminished, and quite significantly.
Well, look, is it, and forgive the pun, a pipe dream for Americans to see themselves in anything like the near future providing natural gas to Europe, and would that have any effect on our domestic market, or do we have so much that it would simply mean a new market and a new trade, perhaps reduction in the trade imbalance if we were able to do that?
I think that the United States has a role to play in this, and that our exports are an important factor.
We're not exporting at all now, are we, natural gas?
Today we are not exporting. We don't have any facilities to export that are ready.
So that's what I mean. When people talk about our becoming a supplier, that would mean a large and immense effort to construct the infrastructure to do so.
Yes, that's true, but some of that's already in train, and the first one will come online in about 18 months from now. And I just would mention that the gas that's already been approved by the Department of Energy is about half the amount of gas that Europe imports annually today. So it's an enormous amount of gas that's already been approved, but the market forces have to be there to build the facilities that have been approved.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'm going to open this up for open conversation on this, so anyone can jump in at any point. I just need to get some clarification there. You had mentioned we're not exporting natural gas now. Would you include Canada, Mexico, or off the Kenai Peninsula of Alaska in that we're not exporting natural gas comment?
I meant to say LNG of the ones that we've been approved through this process. Clearly, Alaska and the pipelines to Canada and in our region.
Okay, so we are a net exporter already of natural gas, and we do LNG off the Kenai Peninsula at this point. But we are exporting, not importing natural gas.
We are also importing natural gas today. We are not a net exporter yet, but we are poised to become one.
Okay. So what was the time frame on that?
I think as our exports, it's hard to predict that. I can say that by 2018 will be, which is the prediction that EIA has for becoming a net exporter. And I would let my colleague address that. But we are, I think it's important to say, as we give permits as the Department of Energy gives permits, they have to be built, and then decisions have to be made to actually sell it.
Right. We talk about it, and we'll come back to Mr. Smith on that. Mr. Hochstein mentions the amount that we've already permitted of the 7 that are there. How many export terminals do you anticipate will actually be constructed?
I can't really say, Mr. Chairman.
Give me your best guess. You're an expert at this. You've lived and breathed it all the time on both sides of the import and export facility side of it. What's your best guess of how many you think will be built?
Well, I mean, I can say a couple things on that, Mr. Chairman. First of all, certainly the Sabine Pass terminal is being built right now.
Right.
So, in terms of making predictions about what will happen subsequently, I mean, my experience is that, I came to this job from industry. I spent 11 years at Chevron before I came to government. And I actually worked on the Sabine Pass terminal when it was an LNG import terminal.
Right.
Right. So, if you would ask me at that point, the question you would have been asking me was how many terminals to import LNG would have been built, and I probably would have made you an estimate because I was, working that field. So, I'm going to demur from giving a numeric total because, our collective faith in our crystal ball should be diminished. I mean, energy.
Okay, we have 7 permits out there already, 24 permits that are still pending. Do you think we will build 31 terminals?
I can safely say that I do not think 31 terminals will be built.
Okay. Do you think we'll build 15?
I don't know.
Well, Mr. Chairman, let's kind of play this out a little bit. Mr. Hochstein, I think, or maybe it was Mr. Smith, said that what has already been permitted would generate about half the LNG that Europe already uses. Now, if we don't want to have, I mean, these companies are big boys, so they can make decisions as to whether or not to build or not to build. They made decisions to build import facilities and then got burned. And I would venture to say they're probably going to be reluctant to move too swiftly because it appears that this particular market varies dramatically from time to time in short periods of time. So if, in fact, half of the natural gas that is being used by Europe today has already been permitted in the United States, and we've got the countries of Australia, Mozambique, Israel, Cyprus, and Lebanon coming online, I mean, what are we saying here? I mean, they're not going to come online and not try and provide that energy to Europe in many respects. So,
which is actually my exact point on this, and is somewhat, and Mr. Smith and I have had this conversation somewhat, if we already know all these terminals are not going to be built, we're giving a competitive advantage to people that filed a permit request a couple of days before or a couple of weeks or months before someone else, where they may have filed and some of these folks filed actually their permit request the exact same day, but they actually won't find out for maybe 2 or 3 years later than other people on it. So we are giving a competitive advantage to some companies, and other companies just have to wait 2 or 3 years until DOE makes the decision and then start with FERC. I agree. All these permits, all these facilities are not going to be built. There will be a lot of competition worldwide, but we will lose the competition worldwide if we continue to delay. So basically, we are saying to Australia and other countries, you go compete worldwide, we are going to discuss it.
Well, but the flip side of that coin is part of our resurgence, part of our economic reinvigoration is the fact that companies are bringing manufacturing back to the United States because the cost of fuel is so expensive in China and elsewhere, and they see the net benefit. And so we are creating jobs in that regard. So, you know, we don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face either.
I totally agree. We are about 4.25 right now for natural gas here in the United States, $12 in Europe for the same piece. So even at that point, companies that are going to relocate are going to relocate. So my conversation is, how do we balance this out? How do we use the economic engine? You know, when you look at job growth over the last several years, the largest area of job growth in America has been energy. And how do we continue to maintain that engine to continue to work in a very difficult economy, to say the least? You continue to provide new markets for them to go to. So we have an economic benefit here in the United States, and we have a geopolitical benefit worldwide, which I want to expand this, if I can, real quickly. Mr. Hochstein, as well, there's a lot of conversation between India and Iran right now dealing with natural gas. So we can continue to talk about Ukraine, but this is not just a Ukraine issue. This is a worldwide issue. Is the State Department comfortable with India's natural gas supplier being Iran? And if not, what are we going to do about that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. We have been implementing, and my office has been leading the effort to implement the Iran sanctions on energy for the last 2 years, especially since Congress passed it in late 2011. First, let me say this. We do not believe there is any truth or likelihood to gas supplies from Iran to India at this time, or to Pakistan. Iran is a net importer of gas at the moment. They export some to Turkey on one side of the country, and they import some other from Turkmenistan. And we have had very close and open and frank conversations with our Indian friends about their oil purchases from Iran, as well as how we would view Iran exports of gas. But currently, Iran doesn't have the gas supply or the infrastructure, and that's due to sanctions. They sit on the largest reserves. But as a result of sanctions, they have not been able to build out that infrastructure, and there's no infrastructure in sight to be able to deliver that. If they do build it, Mr. Chairman, I assure you that our views are very well known to our friends and allies about how we feel about that as long as sanctions are in place.
But are we in a position to be able to say, India, we will supply your natural gas needs?
India is
or
actually,
are they a spot to just say, go in the market and find it?
India is actually it will be one of the first that already has contracted for natural gas from Sabine Pass.
Okay. Other questions? We want to keep the conversation going. Mr. Farenthold, you have not been, this is the second round on this. Do you have questions you want to be able to add?
I do, and I apologize for
not
being here earlier. There's a judiciary markup on human trafficking. So I'm kind of bouncing between committees, but I do have some questions.
Go ahead.
And I'd like to ask our State Department representative, there have been some discussions that they've told me about here today, and I've read your testimony, and a lot of what we focused on is exporting U.S. source LNG to the Ukraine. U.S. LNG exports are an important foreign policy tool for assisting our allies, especially when dealing with Russia, and it would certainly benefit our economy at home. But I'd like to talk to you a minute about the benefits of potentially assisting the Ukraine, not with U.S. LNG, but with world source LNG. The State Department has repeatedly asserted that LNG exports are not a viable option for helping the Ukraine in the near term because U.S. LNG exports are such a long way away. I'm going to have a conversation with Mr. Smith about that when I'm finished talking to you. But I do want to know, while this is unfortunately true, it's my understanding that Ukraine has been in discussions with at least one U.S. company about constructing an LNG terminal in the Ukraine and bringing world source LNG in until the U.S. supplies are available. It's my understanding that this could be done in as little as 6 to 8 months. Notice they can get a plant built in 6 to 8 months. I do point that out. However, Turkey is causing some potential problems by denying access to the Bosporus Straits for the passage of LNG tankers. What is the State Department's view of this? Are you aware of the world source LNG could be a viable solution in the Ukraine? And what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, sir, Congressman. Thank you for that question, and you're right. When we talk about LNG as a solution, I don't think it's a comprehensive solution for all problems, and the U.S. is not. But we are not the only supplier. There are others, and in fact, some of the European countries that are building LNG terminals are in contact with other suppliers for more immediate gas. As far as Ukraine, we've had this conversation for quite a while about the interest in Ukraine to build an LNG facility on the, and it's not really to build a terminal, I'll just say, and that's why it takes shorter. It's to bring in a floating LNG facility, a boat that would come online. So it's a little bit different. The concern and what's blocking it, as you said, in the Black Sea, is exactly what you said. Turkey does not allow LNG tankers to cross through the Bosphorus. They maintain that that is a national security issue. This has been a long-standing position that came up in several years ago.
You guys working with them on it?
I'm sorry?
You guys working to educate them on the fact these things probably aren't going to blow up the way they think they are?
We have very frank, open, and honest conversations with our friends in Turkey about LNG trade and in general about what it means to have open access trade through the Bosphorus.
All right,
but their positions are theirs to have, and they have concerns.
Certainly, we don't control Turkey, but we also Turkey has been a good friend and ally to this country, and hopefully we can bring them along. Mr. Smith, in a previous hearing, we've heard from the Department of Energy on the process for getting LNG export facilities permitted. One of the things that I've heard that the DOE considers is, all right, well, we don't want to get too many of these because we want them all to be profitable. It seems to me, is that the government's appropriate role for the government to decide how many to have so they're going to be profitable, or is that something that should be left up to the market? If the market has a demand for, let's say, 20 LNG export terminals and 25 are built, well, that's not the government's money that's going to be lost. That's those investors' money that's going to be lost for making a bad investment. Can you talk a little bit about that, how big of a consideration that is in the process?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Congressman. That indeed is not a point of disagreement. The Department does not take into consideration whether or not a company is going to be profitable or not. It's not our job to protect companies from themselves. So.
All right. So, and why is it taking so long to get these permits out?
Well, I think it was instructive to hear the dialogue between the ranking member and the chairman in terms of some of the issues that we're dealing with. I mean, there are very strong views on both sides of the equation about the need to balance the increased production and balance of trade and job creation in the places where the terminal is being built, with the impact on consumers and prices and impact on manufacturing sector, environmental factors. So those are balances we have to make.
I'll concede some environmental factors to you, but it seems like when the government starts regulating, based on marketplace factors and such, I think we're getting out of line. But we could have a debate about that between the sides on this dais and probably the administration. But I'm out of time on this. The potential is so much there, and the delays are just frustrating to me. But I'm out of time, so I'll quit preaching.
Yeah, you can get a chance to stay in the second round as well. And this, Ms. Lujan Grisham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, maybe I can take on the preaching. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the hearing. And we're all looking for those investments and balances, wanting to move forward quickly enough that we experience the right kind of results from those investments. In my state, I'm from New Mexico, the energy industry is certainly critical to our economic success. It's a significant component of our current economic base, and in fact, I think it's responsible for about 30% of our state's general fund revenue. And in a poor state like New Mexico, that is the only way we pay for education. It's also clear to me that the natural gas revolution has national security implications, And according to the International Energy Agency, the U.S. has enough natural gas to meet all of its energy needs from domestic resources by 2035, and that allows us to be less reliant on the Middle East and other countries for energy. Now, with that said, and I know that this has been discussed already, we have a responsibility to make sure that we manage the resource in a safe and responsible manner. We want to protect public health, wildlife, the environment, and our water resources. But I think it's important to explore ways to ensure that the Ukraine and our allies have access to reliable supplies of energy for their own national security reasons. And it's certainly all of our understanding that the Ukraine faces numerous energy security vulnerabilities, including a lack to an adequate energy infrastructure, which I just heard you talk about, which I appreciate several times. But I would love it if you would elaborate. I know that we started that conversation with Representative Holmes Norton, but I do want to really talk about specifically, if you could elaborate on what those strategies are and give me a little bit more depth, please.
In securing the energy security in Europe, we're working on a number of factors simultaneously. Number one is to make sure, and I'm going to separate out what we're doing for there's Ukraine and there's the rest of Europe, and primarily the Baltics or South Central Eastern Europe. In Ukraine, it's about making sure that if there is a shutoff of gas in the near term, that we have reverse flow capability in Hungary, in Poland, and in Slovakia, and to expand that to the degree possible that it takes care of the portion of gas that they import. Number two, that we help them become a more efficient and more capable producer of their own gas. They are quite an impressive producer of natural gas, but a lot of that technology is 1970s Soviet technology that can be updated, and they can be using and producing more natural gas on their own. We're also working with them on their interest in exploring their unconventional gas areas. We're working with them to make sure that the reform of the sector is such that they will be able to not end up in the same situation that they are in today, and to make sure that efficiency rates are there so that they can do more with less. That includes subsidy reform, et cetera. In Europe, we have to make sure that the infrastructure is there, that the regulatory reforms that they have started continue. We are working very closely with them on that, and to look and make sure that there's no energy islands in Europe, which is a stated goal of the EU. So the Baltics are a good example of that. LNG is going to be a key factor in that. Lithuania has gone a long way. We work with, the Chairman mentioned Anita Orban, the Ambassador at Large for Hungary, who is a good friend, and we work closely together as they represent and chair the V4, the Visegrad 4 countries, and plus Romania and Bulgaria, to make sure that as the southern corridor is established, that we have more infrastructure to supply Europe. So as you can see, there is not one answer for any of these, and it's unfortunate that you can't fit it into a headline, here's what we do with Europe. It's a lot of different aspects of it.
And given that you have to have a broad approach so that it's sustainable over the long haul, I certainly can appreciate that and recognize, given that we have our own natural gas exploration issues in New Mexico, because we can't recapture the costs, and until a lot of this gets balanced, and I'm very supportive of moving so that we've got more export opportunities, because that's going to create an environment in my state to further that exploration and then do exactly what you said, which is looking at tertiary recovery that's cost-effective and that we've got the infrastructure to do. But what of those strategies in 15 seconds are quick? So I'm looking at some of the stability issues in Ukraine. Can you pick one or two that you think have more of an immediate relief?
I think the reverse flow capability and making sure that Ukraine is able to pay the arrears so that gas is continuing to flow. But the reverse flows are very, very important, and we've made a lot of progress on that, and we need to make more. If I had to say 15 seconds on one thing, that's what it would be.
All right. Thank you.
You can go ahead and spin that out. If you want to go ahead and answer that, that's fine. If you have additional responses.
Why don't you speak about energy efficiency, the lack thereof?
Sure. As we discussed before, and I'll finish the answer, Mr. Chairman, it is critical as we look at Ukraine. It's such a big problem. And getting to, but if we look at the numbers and we look at the production rates and the import rates and what is in the system, as made available by the regulatory change in Europe, we can expand those reverse flows quite considerably, so that maybe not fully for this winter, but in the years to come, Ukraine can choose whether or not to import gas from from Russia, or to do it through other mechanisms. So it is very important. As far as the efficiency rates, ma'am, Ukraine is very inefficient. And then the Department of Energy, together with us, is working on proposals to work with Ukraine to see what we can do to increase efficiency rates. And that means, as many have addressed, the subsidy issue where gas is so cheap that people have no incentive to conserve, but also to put in place the kind of mechanisms and structures that will allow for more conservation so that they can do far more with less or with the same amount. So that's a program that we've done in other countries. DOE and the Department of State work together on these issues, and I think we have a number of proposals that could work very well for Ukraine.
Mr. Smith, can we talk about FERC and the process there, which my understanding is more cumbersome and takes longer, and how does that interrelate with the process that you have ongoing?
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Spear. So I don't want to get too far into the details of the FERC process because I'm not from FERC, and I'm afraid I would not be able to characterize it appropriately. But I would say in general terms, the FERC has an important job of managing the environmental process of evaluating the environmental impact of the terminal itself, and they give the authorization to actually build the terminal. So they have a very detailed and important role to play in this process. Ours is kind of larger, bigger picture, looking at the impact of exporting the molecule, but they have to go through the very detailed process of looking at the specific impact of the site itself. So we work closely with them. We share information in terms of making sure that we know where the different projects are in the queue, but their process is separate from ours.
No, I understand that, but I've been told that their process is cumbersome and long, and that they have a huge backlog. Is that true?
I wouldn't characterize their process as necessarily cumbersome. I think it is appropriately detailed because it is a key part of the decision-making process.
Can I ask a question with that as well? Are some of the applicants in the FERC process, permitting process now, even before they have a DOE permit?
Yes. I mean, we do see applicants going forward with the FERC process, which is also a significant expenditure of funds. I mean, you have to do a lot of work in terms of your initial engineering and your environmental studies. So we do see companies moving ahead of DOE.
They're obviously pretty serious with that. What happens when they get a FERC permit and the DOE process is not complete and they're in the queue? If they have a FERC permit in their hand, let's say they've gone through the whole process and they've completed that, but they don't have a DOE permit, what happens?
Well, I mean, there are two types of authorizations that DOE gives. We give conditional authorizations, which is essentially consistent with the precedent we've set for giving some sort of confidence to individual investors that their final approval will be granted. And then there is the final approval. So we've given 7 conditionals. We've given one final approval. So if there was someone who actually did go through the entire FERC process without a conditional approval, they conceivably could come back for a final authorization from DOE.
And would they still have to wait in line in the queue on that? Let's say they're number 15. I'm just going to make up a number in the list. But they have a FERC permit done, but they're still waiting on DOE on this. Would they have to wait until number 12, 13, 14 is complete before they get it, or would they move up the queue?
That hasn't occurred yet, so I don't have a definitive answer to that question. But conceivably, if they were done with the FERC process, then we'd have to come up with some process for dealing with an applicant who went forward and did all that work without having gone through the conditional approval process. But again, I don't have a precedent to point to that.
But it does become the challenge that if they walk through that process and get that done, they're holding the FERC permit process in place. They're ready to go. It shows a seriousness that others may not have. You mentioned, I don't know how many it is total that have already started through that FERC process on it. Right. Do you know what the number is that have already started through the FERC permit process?
I don't know. I could probably tally that up. I don't know off the top of my head. But there are a number of projects that, even though they have not gotten up in the queue in terms of DOE, they have started with the FERC process.
Okay. I'm guessing, just based on the preliminary report that I have, about 7 companies have started working with FERC to get that permit process, but they don't have DOE approval yet at various forms in that line. So the concern is if they end up with one and they're waiting on the other one, we're back to what Mr. Jordan and Mr. Hochstein had this wonderful conversation about Keystone on. They're in this unique position where they're just waiting. That is the difficulty of all this, and from a business side and from also our foreign partners and allies around the country. And when they've come to talk to me, their one statement is, when will we get an answer?
Right, right.
And the difficulty is I can't tell them that. As a member of Congress, I can't look at them and say, here's when the answer is coming, because there's no predictable answer. Because as we talked about before, it could be 2 weeks before the next permit comes, or it could be 2 years. It might be 20 years. It could be 5.5 years, and still discussing it. So there's no predictability in this, and that's terrible for business, and that's terrible for our allies. So at some point, we have to get some sort of predictability in this process to know, yes, we're working through a process. Here's how many weeks it's going to take. And it's not a red flag to people to say, if you'll just write more letters to us, then we'll slow down the process even more, which is what it seems to be now.
Yeah, well, Mr. Chairman, I'll make a couple points on that. First, I think the Department of Energy has established a track record of getting these authorizations done. Again, these are all very complex, sensitive, complicated evaluations that we have to do, where we have to balance a myriad of sometimes conflicting interests. But the Department has established, I think, a very credible and very reliable track record of moving through the queue. Again, we don't have a clock or bell that says, time for the next application. When the team is done writing the application, the application is released by the Department. The second part of that answer, if someone says, well, what is going to be the availability of natural gas from the United States? As my colleague from the State Department has pointed out, we've already authorized 9.3 billion cubic feet per day of exports, which is equal to all the LNG that goes into Europe. It's equal to half the LNG that Europeans import from Russia. So there's already been a tremendous amount of LNG that we have authorized, even going through this very important public interest determination. And there will be a question that you posed earlier about how many of these will be built. At what rate will the private sector actually build the terminals that we've already authorized? So there is, I think, certainly some demonstrated progress that we've made. It's a tremendous amount of gas that we've already authorized. And indeed, the fact that we are no longer importing large quantities of LNG has already impacted global markets dramatically.
But with that, when you talk about a tremendous amount that's already been permitted, is there some cap amount that you're saying we're going to get to this certain cumulative total and we're not going to permit any more beyond that?
No, there's not. I mean, we have not determined a level beyond which we're not going to permit. So that is not something that the Department of Energy has identified or determined.
Okay. So best interest continues to be a subjective for each location based on the letters that come in and responses that come in for that area, working through looking at did you fill out the application correctly type thing, and trying to evaluate that, getting a chance to interact with Department of State to see who the partners are and how much is demanded from around the country. Obviously, the NERA study that DOE commissioned gave a more objective look at the economic benefits of this. So while I understand you've got letters coming in that say, we don't want this or we do want this, you've also got an economic study that you commissioned that says, yes, this is a good idea and it's in the best interest economically of the United States. Indeed.
I mean, there was a study that was commissioned that was received by the Department that was considered as part of all of our applications to date. But I will point out that as we go forward in time, conditions do change. As was pointed out earlier, a couple months ago, we would not have foreseen sitting in this room talking about issues in the Ukraine because it wasn't an issue that existed.
I'm not sure that's 100% true since, like I said, almost 2 years ago, members of the Ukrainian Parliament were already knocking on my door saying, how quickly could we get this? They were already dealing with Russia randomly shutting off their energy. I think this was a pretty predictable crisis in Central Europe. It may not be specific to Ukraine, but we knew it was coming somewhere. Would you agree or disagree with it, Mr. Hochstein?
I would agree that we've been working on the vulnerability that we identified the vulnerability that Europe has with its reliance on a single source in many cases, and we've been trying to reduce that. So, yeah, I would agree that this is a crisis that is a surprise to some, but not to others. The energy portion of the crisis.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if we ever got clarification of how much natural gas is going to be generated by these other countries that you had mentioned earlier, Mr. Hochstein? Can you?
By the other producers coming online, a lot of this is we're early in the process. Israel has already taken care of, with the first 2 fields that have come online, the first big one, Tamar, has addressed their entire 8 BCM, their entire domestic needs. They've come up with an export policy, so it's not only about how much you're going to produce, but how much you're going to put on the market, that 40% of their production, of Israeli production, will go on to exports. We don't know the amount yet out of Cyprus. We have 1 field that's been proven, but there's going to be drilling throughout the summer and fall by 3 companies, 1 U.S. and 2 European. Mozambique is about double the size of the Israeli find, but they need to get their act together as well, and we work with them. So there's a lot of the gas from Eastern Africa is going to end up going to Asia, if you think of what makes sense from a transportation perspective. And this takes us back to the argument, this is not just about Ukraine and Europe. This is about a global demand, and as we're putting more product on the market from a variety of places, there's demand that is rising as well in Asia in an impressive pace, and that has to be addressed. So what happens to Europe is not they're not entirely at their own decision making. There's a lot of market forces that are going to have to come into play, and as we see what the prices are around Asia, that will determine what the supplies are available for Europe. But that pressure is already there. As a result of our production and not importing, Europe for the first time actually went out and renegotiated and forced the Russians into a renegotiation of price. And we were able to get better terms from the Russians a couple of years ago in a way that they weren't able to do that in the past. So these dynamics are having real impacts. I'm with my colleague here. It's very difficult to make some predictions on this, because if you read anybody's predictions in 2009 onto global supplies and trade of natural gas, they would have been very, very mistaken today in hindsight.
They continue to be. Mr. Hochstein, you mentioned before that State Department is helping some of the folks in Europe with non-conventional explorations of oil and gas. And you made the comment that you're helping them focus on science, not emotion. Can you clarify that?
I didn't say that I'm helping them. I said that we recommend that decision when you're going to make a decision on whether or not to explore unconventional and shale, it's important to look at what the science is and what isn't true. We've had a great experience here in the United States with a regulatory system of both the Federal and the States of looking at that. And what we'd like to do is to brief them and educate and show what we've been able to learn from the experience here. We've brought a variety of delegations here to the United States together with the EPA, Department of Interior, Department of Energy, to learn from the process here. And what's great about it is that it's not a monolithic, here's how to do it. Here's how we do it at the Federal level, but then look at what Colorado is doing versus what New York or Pennsylvania or Texas, et cetera. And I think that's been very useful, and we've actually been, there's a larger and larger interest in that program. There are some countries that have announced moratoriums on shale development and exploration. And if that's their decision to do it, and if they don't want to explore it, that's fine. We continue these conversations even with those countries, but obviously don't have programs with them to support the process if they're going to have a moratorium.
I'd add one thing, if I could,
yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, to that observation. A couple of years ago, I traveled to Warsaw with Mr. Bob Skuda, who's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau for Energy and Natural Resources, where Mr. Hochstein works. And we participated in what was called a session that was held by the IEA called the Golden Rules for a Golden Age of Gas. And it was a collection of subject matter experts from around the world convening to discuss their experiences in shale gas and unconventional gas development. Again, I'll reiterate, it's in our job to tell other sovereign nations what to do with their resources, but we think it is in the best interest of the United States to be as open and transparent in sharing the best practices that we've learned here to help build kind of a scientific basis for decision making. So we see that as being positive and something that we affirmatively support through our actions.
Okay, so just for clarification on this, State Department is working with other countries that have shale to be able to bring them to the United States, to be able to interact with some of our regulators, to be able to look at some of the science side of this, how you can actually do it, do fracking, do horizontal drilling, to be able to take this on, because obviously their country, well, depending on the nature of the country and whether they own their own oil companies, as some places do and some don't, basically exposing them to what we're doing in the United States, saying this is a good idea for you to be able to take this on so you can provide your own energy resources in your own country.
I would agree with everything except for the last sentence.
Okay.
It's not for you to encourage you to do so. If you decide, it's not our decision,
Right,
it's a sovereign decision. If they decide that they want to move ahead and go ahead and exploit it, we will be there to support them with this program if they're interested, to show them all the other things that you just said. Yes.
Right. Yeah. You can't force a country to say, I want to be independent. But most countries would say if they have the opportunity not to be dependent on someone else for energy, they would most likely take that.
Mr. Chairman, at times there are also external factors and external forces that come into countries to encourage them not to explore those resources.
I would say Oklahoma would be welcome to be able to receive folks from around the world to be able to show them how we do natural gas exploration, how we do it extremely well, extremely clean, and our regulatory scheme in the state of Oklahoma and how we actually regulate things as far as exploration is exemplary. I encourage people to come drink our water and breathe our beautiful air and see our wonderful land, and to be able to see how you can do this and can do it clean. We've had over 100,000 fracs in Oklahoma, and it's a beautiful state and has very clean water and very clean air. And so that as you mentioned before, trying to deal with the science, not the emotion. When you're finished with the rest of the world, I'd appreciate it if you come back to the United States and share what you have learned as well about dealing with the science, not the emotion. One other comment, unless the ranking member has another question on this. I want to shift topics. I promise I won't stay long. I want to bring up the issue of crude oil exports. And what we're hearing from our international partners on that, we already export refined products around the world. We're currently not exporting crude. What are we hearing? We've heard quite a bit from people that they're very interested in our LNG. What are we hearing about crude and the request for that from our allies?
I think just like in the United States, this is a conversation that is happening around the world, and I think it was the next logical conversation that we were going to see happen. We are following that discussion of what it means. We're very early stages of this conversation. I've followed what's been done here in Congress, both in the House and the Senate side of discussion on what does this mean to have crude oil exports. I think this is a much bigger discussion. We've been so focused on the LNG side that the oil side is next. So I think we're in the early stages of understanding what it means and listening to the views that are being expressed. I think there's less of a drumbeat as far as our partners. I think there's more of a focus on natural gas. But there's definitely an interest in the topic of what the United States is going to do, but more from the aspect, less of independence for those countries like the discussion in gas, and more from the aspect of understanding how will this impact the mid and long-term oil markets and prices and structures. We've talked a lot about gas today, but we have the same changes, radical changes in the oil markets around the world today that are happening in gas. They're just slightly different. Big changes from the days where OPEC dominated the market, new players, and with most OPEC countries today producing at maximum capacity for a variety of reasons, some for sanctions, some for political instability, some for technical reasons, and some because that's the most they can do. The question of what happens to the market if the United States starts exporting is one that is fascinating those who follow the energy markets.
So let me just complete that thought. Prices drop worldwide if we start exporting. Correct or not correct?
I think it would depend on the dynamic. There's been a lot of, I've learned one thing in this business is that any prediction on oil prices those who make those predictions are usually regret them later.
It tends that all it takes is a little cross-border war somewhere in the Middle East and it changes everyone's gas prices all the time. I do understand that. But is there an unease, I would say, in the OPEC countries that the United States could become an exporter?
I think they're watching our decision-making process very carefully.
Okay. Mr. Smith, you want to make a comment about that?
I probably second the comments of Mr. Hochstein. There's been more focus on gas, obviously, because there's a statutory process for dealing with natural gas, and there's not a statutory process for dealing with oil. But this certainly is a topic that we think is of interest, but we don't have a direct role in even the current limited capability of exporting oil if there's waivers granted. So the DOE does not have a role there.
DOE doing a study of oil capacities, what's coming online, our capability of production, and what we'll actually use?
Well, that's something that obviously the Energy Information Agency follows very closely, and we are that's a kind of semi-autonomous part of the Department of Energy. We are consumers of their analysis, so we follow that very closely.
Semi-autonomous. I'm enjoying that conversation. That we could have that conversation about several agencies, actually, and several departments. Semi-autonomous. The length of time issue, you and I have talked about often, as far as the permitting, getting back to LNG.
Right.
Predictability, I think, is extremely important, not only for American companies and American production, but I think it's extremely important for our international partners at this point. I don't know how we get there, because based on what you're saying, your team is working on it, but there are no deadlines and there are no demands on certain time periods. It's we'll get it done when we get it done. And my concern is for our international partners, they need some certainty. The folks that have come to visit my office have all said the same thing. When?
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me interject then. If this is one of speediness and it's still doing the job, then the question becomes: are the fees that are being charged to provide this evaluation adequate to do the job, and does the office need more staff? Maybe you can address that as well.
Well, thank you. I'll make 2 points on that. First, I think that if you look at, when I go and talk about LNG at various venues, I'm often followed by a market expert who will put up a chart on the graph on the wall that shows the exact length of time between various DOE actions and juxtapose that against prices or a bunch of other things. And there's all this analysis about, well, why is it 10 days longer between these two than these other two? So those are always interesting to watch, because there's all this theorizing about what's the backstory about the extra 4 days here. And the bottom line is that there's not a backstory. All of these are slightly different, but what we can see is that we have established, I think, a fairly reliable track record of getting these authorizations out in a reasonable amount of time. There has been a consistency over the past year or so. It varies from order to order within a reasonable amount, because all the orders are not the same. So it's our intention to make sure that we are moving forward in that manner. We've already authorized, again, 9.3 BCF, which is a considerable amount. And the biggest uncertainty really now is what is going to be the reaction of the private sector that's already received these authorizations. At what rate are these terminals going to be built? Because they are massive multi-billion-dollar investments that are complex to get built, and they'll be built if the market determines that that there's going to be a demand for U.S. gas.
But if they have the FERC permit done, they're not moving in line, or they are moving in line?
Again, we've got a number of applicants that have not yet received a conditional authorization from the Department of Energy that are working through the FERC process. We have not come to the position where someone has finished that process in advance of having received a conditional authorization. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that question, because it's still sort of a hypothetical at this point.
I understand, but that will be a big issue.
Right.
Obviously, this becomes very, very significant. I would hope that you're addressing this, that if someone is holding the FERC process permit in their hand, but it's 2.5 years of still waiting on the DOE piece, or it's unpredictable, they just don't know. I know you said we've established a process that has some predictability, but just because it's been done that way in the past, as you mentioned already, doesn't mean it's going to be done that way in the future.
Well,
you're not saying it's going to be 6 to 10 weeks between each one. You're just saying this is what we've done in the past.
I'm saying that we've established a track record. But again, all of this is a unprecedented activity. The Department of Energy, when this market changed, and you referred to this energy production revolution in your opening statement, that has taken the regulators within my organization, and they've gone from looking at import terminals to export terminals. Everything has changed. Right. And so I think there are a number of hypothetical situations that one could come up with and say, well, what are you going to do in this situation? What are you going to do in that situation? We're busy and hard at work at making sure we're doing the work that's before us, that we are meeting our commitment to get these out in as timely a manner as possible. And as we run into new situations, those are things that we're going to have to consider and make the best decision that we can.
So it is possible at that point, if they're holding a FERC permit, for them to come out and be able to step out of line.
Yeah,
I mean, we got to reevaluate that.
I'll certainly say that at all times we are looking at ways to make the process better and more efficient based on signals that are being sent by the market. So as the market sends us signals that are different from the signals that were sent when we established a certain process, we're not inflexible to doing the thing that's appropriate based on appropriate market signals and our assessment of public interest.
Okay. We'll still have more conversations about this, obviously. Because I understand you're still saying, look at our history, but there's no predictability in what happens in the future. And that's really a much-needed thing right now, both in our nation, development of infrastructure. If any of these facilities are going to be built, we've got to get pipelines to them. That's years in the process. It's years of construction. It's lots of capital. It's going out and pursuing contracts worldwide. It's our international partners saying that, okay, we are going to get it. Here's the date we're going to happen. All of those things were all pending on your team making a decision and people knowing when it's going to happen. So not to say you've got the whole world in your hands, but there are a lot of folks around the world that are waiting on decisions that if we can't get predictability of when they're going to happen, there are a lot of folks around the world that are just waiting, and a lot of economic development here in the United States that's waiting to be released pending a decision from your office. So if we can get some level of predictability on that, it would certainly help our economy and would help our geopolitical situation as well.
Understood.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to close by thanking our two witnesses who have, I think, presented some very persuasive arguments for why this is global in nature and not something that the United States in and of itself is going to fix. But certainly your admonition that there should be some predictability is worthy of us reviewing. But I would urge us to look at FERC as being part of that, and they are absent from this discussion here today, and they are a key component as well. So thank you for your good work and for your service to our country.
Gentlemen, thank you. With this hearing is adjourned.